Hi all, this game is Addison versus Fischer in round 7 of the US Championship, in which Fischer had an 11-0 clean sweep of the field. So playing black, he faced e4 from Addison, and he played e5, which is quite a rare choice by Fischer, who usually plays a Sicilian defence. After knight f3, he played knight c6, inviting the Ruy Lopez, and he played a6 now, which is all standard stuff, and after bishop a4, the usual standard move is knight f6. Fischer played the much rarer continuation b5, and after bishop b3, he played knight a5. There have been some exciting games with bishop takes f7 check here, but white didn't play that. He played actually d4, and after ed, queen takes d4, Fischer now plays knight e7. So that's quite interesting already, because the knight protects the d5 square from there, but it also might come to g6 later. So it's, in a way, it's more flexible than coming to f6, and also any e5s by white would have gained a tempo. So there's some justification for playing the knight to e7. It also supports Fischer's later bishop b7 and d5. White now played c3, and Fischer snapped off that light square bishop before it had the chance to escape, say, to c2. So one of the points of this rare bird system is to get the two bishops from white. After bishop f4, Fischer now played d5. And after e5, we see now one of the clever ideas of knight e7 is c5. Now the c5 pawn is immune. If white had taken it here, then knight f5 traps the queen, and white's forced to play something like bishop g5 in order to get the queen out of the trap with minimal loss of material. There's nowhere for the queen to go. Say bishop g5. White, his only hope is say queen d7, then queen b6. But black would just win a piece here by taking the queen, and peace up. Thanks very much. So, after c5, white played now queen d3, and now knight g6 was played, forcing the bishop into quite a committal place on g3, stuck behind its own pawn on e5. And after bishop e7, white played now knight bd2, and this hasn't been played at all routinely by Fischer. He plays a very Nimzovician idea now of blockading the e-pawn and gaining space on the king side. Because the centre is in effect closed, it's difficult for white to arrange counterplay. So it's a beautiful knight manoeuvre instead of the routine castling to blockade that e-pawn. And note this bishop is still tied down just behind that pawn, and it's being menaced now by black, who just plays g5. So Fischer's lashing out, gaining space, not just on the queen side, but on the king side now. So it's a great game featuring play on both sides of the board. After queen b6, he's preparing perhaps the castle queen side now. But first, he plays d4, opening this dangerous bishop on that diagonal. After knight f3 to d2, white now faced g4, so this dangerous attack trying to rip open the white king, forcing a pawn to h4. And now Fischer played queen c6, so it's all very aggressive stuff, threatening just to mate white on g2. White now wanted to exchange queens to relieve the pressure, and Fischer didn't mind. He just carried on castling queenside and was just in a much better position here. This pawn is not going anywhere, so it's going to be lost. So it does seem to be a clearly better position for black. After rook a1, Fischer could just play king b7. So white plays c4. And actually, Fischer now plays king d7, which is even more aggressive than king b7, because the king might come out to e6, believe it or not. After rook a1, rook a8. And now after knight e4, Fischer starts using his king and knight more aggressively, so he improves the position of both these pieces. With this bishop takes e4, he now plays knight g7. So the knight's still coming back to hit h4, but also potentially this bishop on G3. And now we also see King E6, the king coming out to harass that E pawn. So white's been tied down, potentially. After knight E4, white just gave up material. B takes C4, B takes C4, and Fischer perhaps could have just taken on H4. But has to be still careful. Actually, bishop takes H4 wouldn't be that good because of knight takes C5 check. And if king takes E5, knight D3 check. And now rook E1 check. So that knight would be lost. So he has to be careful. He can't take that pawn. So what he first plays is rook HB8. So he's playing on both sides of the board. White's being tied in knots now, overstretched. H4 and C4 being targets. After knight D4, he picks up one of the targets on the king side. It's now completely safe to take that H pawn. So Fischer's now a clear pawn up and still has got queenside pressure. A big pass pawn on D4. And he's just won a pawn on the king side. So after rook E4, bishop G5, he's winning even more material, because if the knight moves, then C4 drops. So after F4, E takes, knight takes, Fischer simply plays bishop E3 check, and after king H2 wins a second pawn, and white's had enough. So white was actually positionally and tactically crushed in this game, with the pressure on both sides of the board. Let's have a look in conclusions and summary. Fischer played a very novel opening system. Instead of the normal Ruy Lopez systems with black, he played knight A5 and white played D4. So white consigns himself to losing the two bishops. But there is usually some compensation for this. Fischer though played very expertly to immediately grab the bishop before it retreated, and now played for D5. Once there was a pawn on E5, he had in view a Nimzovician plan of a blockade on E6. He first plays C5 to gain space on the queen side and puts the bishop, the white bishop, in an uncomfortable G3 square, so it's very passive. And now he starts the aggressive thrusts on the king side. So he's playing like a composer. He's playing on both sides of the board. After queen B6, knight F1, D4, this bishop on B7 comes to life, and white hasn't got a light squared bishop, so was tempted to exchange queens to relieve the pressure. However, that was the beginning of even more torture now. After the bishop exchange here, Fischer found a great way to exert pressure now with this knight G7 move, blockading with the king on E6, and then coming down to pressurise the B file. The opportunity was ripe to win the H pawn, and then the C pawn was a liability, which was lost next, and that won Fischer the game. So it was an excellently played game by Fischer, now winning 7 games in a row in the classic US Championship of 1963. I hope you enjoyed that game. See you on YouTube. Thanks very much.